Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Lead Ahead. I'm here with my friends and classmates, Nita and Nadia. Today, we will discuss a topic that has been brought up in class multiple times and was also posted on D2L as something that MBA students in our cohort are interested in learning more about: transitioning from an individual contributor on a team to a team leader and all the challenges that come with that significant adjustment. So, in this episode, the team will recount their own experiences with this topic and how they relate to the theory learned in class. And I'll also go through some key insights based on the things that I've picked up as we've gone through our leadership class. So, I'll start with section one, transitioning from peer to leader. So, the way this episode is going to be laid out is we're going to have three sections. First section will be, as I said, transitioning from peer to leader. Section number two will be delegation and empowerment. Section number three will be communication and conflict resolution. We kind of decided on these three sections as the three very important topics related to moving from team member to team leader. And then I will also go through key insights for each section, and we'll end with a discussion question that our guests, Nadia and Nita, will tell us about some of their experiences. So, starting with section one, transitioning from peer to leader. As MBA students who are focused on their careers, many of us will experience the growing pains that are involved with switching positions, changing departments, and becoming responsible for people who used to be our peers. As was seen with Melissa Richardson in the case study, Growing Managers, moving from team member to team leader, transitioning from a high functioning contributor to a manager or leader is rarely a smooth process. And just because you are successful as a contributor does not mean you'll automatically be successful as a manager. The two positions require different skill sets that need to be built over time with thoughtful reflection and, of course, lots of practice. So, some key insights that we learned in class and that have kind of been recurring themes for this topic are qualities and traits that are required when stepping into a leadership position. So, as discussed in class, effective leadership is the ability to influence a group towards a common set of goals. And to do this effectively, you really need to have communication, accountability, and collaboration in order to build trust and a mutual understanding between teammates and the team leader. So, one big way to do this is actually shifting your whole mindset when making the transition from team member to team leader. So, one focus area is moving from individual value to collective value, kind of how we talked about in class about servant leadership. Leaders must prioritize team success ahead of their individual success in order to avoid failures of the team, and the same goes for setting goals for the team. This also involves a shift from an emphasis on speaking to an emphasis on listening. Successful active listening involves reading physical cues as well. So, moving on to our first discussion question for our audience. Nadia and Nita, can you think of a time when you transitioned from being an individual contributor on a team to becoming a leader? And what kind of challenges did you encounter?
I guess I'll start. Wow, that's a really that's an interesting thing to think about. I keep thinking about my time working as a nurse during the pandemic. I think that brought out the best parts of leadership and also the worst parts of leadership in the healthcare system. And I think because there was so much uncertainty in the whole industry as a whole, across pretty much the whole world, it was this universal experience as frontline workers to kind of walk in and not know if you're going to be taking care of patients or, delegating team roles or, picking up the slack for the lack of staff showing up. So I think during that time, I saw myself transition from being just a bedside RN to more of a leadership role by picking up some more leadership tasks, such as, figuring out staffing because charge nurse was unable to do everything. So she took the team leads from each hub to kind of help out with more charge nurse roles. And so going from that position of I'm just going to come here, do my job, take care of my patients and go home to more of a, okay, well, I can't just go home because no one's coming in after me to take care of these 8 patients that have COVID, and we don't have any extra support on hand. So how are we going to deal our cards essentially? Who's going to stay? Are we going to call in, overtime? And a lot of those tasks are not easy to do when you're a fairly young nurse telling someone older than you or someone who has more experience than you, hey, you actually have to stay an extra 4 hours because we don't have anyone. So that was kind of the first time in my career where I kind of had to pivot and kind of go back and forth between being that um, just that person on the team doing their, job, to shifting a bit more towards a leadership position and then telling people to um, kind of telling them what to do, really. And it's a really interesting environment to do it in, especially as you guys can probably recall how the pandemic made everyone feel and act. So yeah, that's kind of what I thought of when you were talking about all that, Jake.
Awesome. Well, those are great real world examples. Thank you for that. Nadia, do you have anything that you wanted to add?
So I can't think of, so I haven't personally experienced this before, but I think I've seen people that have, transitioned to a team leader, but I feel like the challenge with that is people don't respect you because at one point you were at their level and now they can just like see you above them. So I feel like how do you get that respect from people? How do you get people to listen to you when you delegate tasks to them, right? So I feel like that would be the challenge when you, I guess, transition to a team leader. So yeah, I can't personally say that I have experienced this, but I feel like some of that, the people that I've seen transition is like, just constantly have that open communication with the people or with their team to kind of remind them that, okay, this is like a new kind of role that I'm in, but I'd value your feedback. I want to have like this open communication with you guys, and then just kind of take it from there. Like you don't want to just you don't want to kind of open the door for people to think that you're favoring one over the other just because based off like your previous relationship when you were a team. But then now that you're transitioned, you kind of have to treat everyone equally and then just like establish that ongoing communication, I would say.
Yeah, no, very good points. I know not everyone has had the experience of actually moving from team member to team leader, but what you said about how do you get people to respect you is a really good point. I I'm kind of on the in-between of the two sides where I have transitioned in the last year from being a systems analyst to being a team lead for our department, but it was interesting because although I was got the title of team lead, I don't really have a ton of the responsibilities that you would think of being for a team lead. So I don't approve my team's time or hours. I don't do performance reviews. I'm not a part of the interviewing process for new people in our department. So it's interesting because I kind of got the title, but none of the responsibility. So I've really just been trying to act as an influencer in my department rather than be someone who's more directing. So I know in class we talked about the different styles of leadership. So I'm really trying to be kind of a coach and kind of be a supporter for my team because my other two teammates, they've been at the company longer than me. They have more experience. So it doesn't really make sense for me to kind of come at them as like a manager when in reality, we're basically on the same level still in everything but title. So I'm really just trying to kind of act like I'm on their level. But yeah, like you said, Nadia, it comes down to how do you get them to respect you? How do you get them to see you as a team lead, even if you don't really have all that much responsibility over them. But yeah, that's kind of been my strategy so far. So thank you guys for sharing your experiences. So that'll be it for section one. Moving on to section two, which is delegation and empowerment. So when moving into a leadership position, there's a whole new range of responsibilities that you'll be held accountable for. This includes things like performance reviews, time and attendance approvals, leadership training, budget ownership, and a lot more. So how are you supposed to complete all these new things when the day is still only 8 hours long? The answer is quite simple. You must consider how to delegate some of your existing work, empower your team to complete that work effectively so that you don't get burnt out as a leader. In the case of Melissa at her flower company, in the case study that we took a look at in class, she took on a whole new range of responsibilities, but was still completing paperwork that her staff should have been doing and had difficulty letting go of the things that she was used to doing as a team member. So, moving on to some key insights for this section. Why do so many leaders fail to delegate effectively? I'll use John as kind of an example person just because he's the name that we used in class pretty extensively. So, why do leaders fail to delegate? One item is just a lack of trust in the team. John doesn't know how to do expense reports. It would be easier if I just did them myself. Lack of perceived time. It would take me hours to teach John expense reports, whereas I could finish this in 30 minutes and be done with it. Some leaders delegate, but without empowerment or accountability. I told John to do his expense reports himself, but his final report was riddled with mistakes, so I just did it myself in order to meet the deadline. And finally, some leaders fear their control is actually threatened by empowerment. For example, if John starts doing all the departmental reports and makes a mistake, I'll still be accountable for any mistakes that he makes. And on the flip side, if he nails the reports, then he'll show he's actually better than me. And I don't want that either as a manager. So, considering these things, how can leaders work to improve their delegation skills? So, looking at some of the things in class and some of the case studies, some of the key items that I found were focusing on empowering team members to complete tasks independently. A large part of empowerment is actually education and investment. So, this would mean teaching John to complete these expense reports. It might be a short-term investment, but it will result in long-term time savings, and John will have more autonomy in his day-to-day. And also holding team members accountable. If John submits a bad report, ask yourself, did he know how to do it in the first place? Was he comfortable asking for help? And then make sure you take time out of your day, even if you're completely busy and slammed, to sit down with John and go through the report. Once a mutual understanding is met, you can monitor the performance and act accordingly. So that leads us to our second discussion question. Nadia and Nita, can you think of a time when you encountered ineffective delegation or empowerment, and what was the result of that?
Yeah, I don't know, today's just me reminiscing on my pandemic nursing days. But I think what you said about not having enough time, and part of that time being the lack of time for educating someone or mentoring someone so that they can then be empowered to do the job themselves. I think that was one of my personal barriers to delegating effectively as team lead during the pandemic. And part of that is because, again, the nature of the job is very different than a corporate situation. So you don't have the same, 20, 30 employees that you see every day. Every 8 to 12 hours, there's a new shift worker, there's a new face, there's a new nurse, and there's a new set of skills that come with that. And so if you are working, which we saw a lot of with, newer, younger nurses who maybe don't have the experience, maybe they've never drawn blood from an arterial line or started an IV or done an NG. And so when you're trying to delegate tasks, you have to take their skill set into consideration and also the time. We have X amount of hours, we've got this to do in terms of priorities. Who is actually well equipped to do that? And many times it was the team leads and the nurses that work there full time, have been there for a few years, that were the only ones that were able to do that. So we saw ineffective delegation, and there wasn't really a way to fight that because a lot of the stuff was out of our control. We couldn't make someone less sick magically because it would be more convenient for us, or, magically have another nurse show up to take off some of the workload. So I think that was a very interesting situation. And again, I think what you mentioned earlier briefly about burnout, I think that was also kind of an underlying factor in some of the ineffective delegation techniques I saw and practiced, because really there was nothing else to do. You had to get it done. So you just kind of went and did it and hoped that the person coming on after you knew how to do it as well.
Yeah, no, super good points. I've never really thought about delegation when it comes to healthcare, but it becomes even more important when you're dealing with people's health, because if you get burnt out at that job, like someone's going to have to pick up the pieces in order to continue the quality of care for that person. So yeah,
Exactly.
very good examples. Nadia, how about yourself?
I think in the corporate world, I feel we've come across people that are maybe are less motivated to do the job. What happens in this case, people that are really good at their job feel the burnt out because they're given more tasks now, given more stuff to do. So I feel like there's not equal amount of like tasks between the two. And so I feel like people that are highly, good at their job are often like, more stressed, more burnt out, more feel less valued and less heard or seen by their leaders because of that and like unsuccessful kind of delegation because it always falls on them because they're doing really good job. So I feel like that's just, it comes down to the leader and how they kind of understand their people. And if you're not taking the time to understand your people, know their values, know that they're, overwhelmed with their work, really just I feel like a lot of people end up leaving. And I think that have been my experience in the corporate world. Yeah.
Yeah, no, very good points. I've definitely seen that in the corporate world as well, where if you're competent and you're good at something, it doesn't always result in people saying, good job, like take a break. It
Mhm.
usually results in getting more work of that sort until you have a huge pile because it gets delegated to you just simply because you can do it well. So I've definitely seen a little bit of that task disparity myself. And in terms of my own experiences with delegation, I have definitely had experiences at my current job where past managers have failed to delegate. And I've been racking my brain trying to figure out, like, why wouldn't they? And I think it comes down to a lack of confidence in delegating work. At my current company, everyone has their little niche of they know how to do it, so they do it, and no one else knows how. This has become a big issue at our company because if someone leaves or that person is sick that day, then no one else really knows how to complete that activity. And it almost seems like to me that people hold on to those things kind of as job security, where they fear that if they tell someone how to do that, then it's making their own role less important or less specialized, which isn't the case at the end of the day. I like to relate it to the getting hit by a bus metaphor where you should be able to, your leader should be able to function if any one of the teammates gets hit by a bus and they're in the hospital and can't come into work. I know it's kind of a dark metaphor, but that's kind of the thought process is one person missing a day of work shouldn't result in everyone else failing to complete their jobs as a result. So thank you guys for sharing your insights. We're going to move on to our final section of the podcast today, which is communication and conflict resolution, both very important items when considering moving from a team member to a team leader. So, yeah, while communication is still extremely important when acting as an individual contributor on a team, it moves from important to critical when moving into a leadership position. As discussed in class, one of the major failures of leaders is effective communication with staff, whether it's communicating expectations, team goals, or simply not making time to communicate with the team about the issues they're facing. You can be the most amazing manager ever, hitting targets left and right, but if you don't speak to your team frequently and listen to them, you'll be viewed as an absentee leader. When 1,000 employees were surveyed in the Interact Harris poll, the top communication issues identified were things like failing to recognize achievements, not giving clear directions, not having time to meet with employees, and many more that were indicative of a failure to communicate. So, some key insights from this section that we went over in class and with some of the readings. Why do so many leaders fail to communicate effectively? Well, they assume that employees are fine. For example, John is busy working away on his sales reports. He must not need me for anything today. If leaders fail to delegate and empower, they might not even have time in the day to touch base with their staff. Like what Nita said, like it might just be a straight up everyone's burnt out, overworked. They don't have time to touch base with their staff, and that can leave their staff feeling abandoned or like they're on their own with that day of work, and that can result in poor performance and mental health issues for that staff member. So some other reasons why leaders fail to communicate effectively, they're task focused rather than people focused, which it's a delicate balance, but leaders can't let their people focus slip, or this will actually result in lower task outcomes. And finally, they might just not know how to communicate. Communication can be extremely difficult to master and often involves going out of your comfort zone. And it can give a lot of people anxiety, and they'd rather practice avoidance rather than dealing with something head on and communicating about it. So, what can leaders do to improve how they communicate with their teams? Some items that I've noticed at work that I think would be beneficial for leaders to consider would be purposefully setting aside time for 360-degree feedback. Many managers review their employees quite regularly, but rarely have employees review them and tell them what they need from them as a manager. Regularly communicate expectations. If a project requires certain targets to be hit, communicate that collaboratively and positively. And if someone does a good job, don't wait until the performance review to tell them. Let them know right away and provide incentives and engagement, such as buying them a coffee or giving them a kudos on a presentation. It could be the highlight of their week and possibly the only feedback they've received in a while. I know this is one thing that I've experienced at work where you do a good job, a lot of the time you won't hear back from anyone. And if you do a bad job, you hear back from a lot of people. So it's almost like people are at my work are conditioned to feel positive about not getting any feedback, which is definitely not a great thing to have at a company. So moving on to the conflict resolution side of things, why would these conflict resolution skills be so important in the workplace for leaders? As a leader, problems are now filtered and escalated to you. It is the leader's responsibility to deal with these issues, whether they are interpersonal or task-oriented. If you're used to just being a team member, you might not be used to having all of these things filtered up to you. So it's definitely an adjustment, but it's very important that these conflicts are dealt with in turn, because if they're ignored or if they're swept under the rug, team performance and satisfaction can definitely take a significant hit, and it might result in turnover on your team or poor performance. So in the end, it's critical that leaders understand how they handle conflicts and to modify their approach to suit specific scenarios and specific personalities within their team. So moving into our final discussion of the day, Nadia and Nita, do you recall an experience where a lack of communication led to a diminished experience at work or school? And was that conflict resolved effectively?
I think absentee leadership is something that I've experienced a decent bit of in the healthcare setting. And I honestly, for a long time, didn't even realize that it wasn't really normal or even expected in, the field for getting feedback or any sort of, check-ins with your manager on a regular basis. It was only when something had gone wrong as a team, or if you yourself had, done something wrong, when you would actually see the manager. And that was something that I didn't pay attention to early on in my career. But when I thought, looked back and thought about it, I was like, that's really not normal. And again, going back to, of course, the environment and the context, yes, it's harder in a healthcare setting versus a corporate setting to sit down with, like 200 employees who work at various times during the day. But I think the attitude that management had towards employees and especially frontline workers was that, oh, everyone's here to do a task, everyone's doing the same job, you just got to do your job and go home, and if something's wrong, we'll deal with it then. But nobody really brought up the good stuff that was being done, and it was always an emphasis on the stuff that maybe wasn't being done. And again, given that context, going into something like, the pandemic, which I've talked so much about today, it really does, call for those things like high turnover and burnout and all of the low morale and all of that. And we saw that. And it was making headlines. It was a horrible, horrible work environment for a lot of people. And I think people, employees as well, started realizing the impact that leadership actually had on their work. And yes, of course, some people, they don't love, being micromanaged and they just want to come to work, do their thing, and go home. But I think as an environment, it makes such a big difference when, if there is conflict or if there is, a problem with recognition, then that really does kind of play into kind of the morale and the work environment and actually has a really negative impact, even if you're not, having to do those annoying, weekly stand-ups or whatever you want to compare it to. But I noticed that very early on, and I was like, that's not, I don't know if I like that. And so, one of the reasons I did pursue the MBA was to kind of hopefully be in a role one day where I can change that. But yeah, it's crazy how quietly that absentee leadership and lack of appropriate conflict resolution and fair recognition and all of that kind of eats away at your employees and your team.
Yeah, excellent points. Yeah, I can definitely empathize with you that if the only time you're getting feedback is when you've done something wrong, then you're going to start to associate feedback with those negative feelings and negative emotions. And that's just, yeah, it's not conducive to self-improvement. How about you, Nadia? What are your thoughts?
I think my experience with this has been so in the corporate world, I feel like a lot of organizations, they really just care about their bottom line. And I was put in a position where there was a conversation about, there was the topic of promotion was lingering around. And so I feel like I was excited for the experience, for the opportunity, obviously, but I feel like that lack of communication from the upper management kind of just like impacted my experience kind of negatively, where it was kind of just dragging on for months and months, and I was not being kept in the loop. So I think when I was in that position, I was just being persistent and kind of just like following up, kind of just doing the work for them instead of them updating me with the promotion opportunity, but just me kind of pushing, not in an aggressive way, more like, just show the initiative, be more engaged, kind of just follow up, see where they're at, and then just kind of hopefully get a good response from it. But I feel like, lack of communication definitely just makes or breaks the experience for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. I've, in my current role, experienced pretty significant lack of communication around our busiest times of year. So right now we're going through our budget season, planning for next year, and it's so hard to get a word in with any manager, any director, anyone in our C-suite. And it really kind of causes projects to grind to a halt because our our company is very hierarchy focused. I have it, like I said, am a team leader, but I don't have any of the authority or decision-making power that you would typically think a team leader would have. So we have to rely on our managers and our directors to make decisions, but then they don't have time to make those decisions because they're so busy, and then they don't delegate because they feel like they're the ones that need to be doing that work. And then it kind of just cycles and cycles until work kind of just grinds to a halt during busy periods. And yeah, staff are kind of left wondering what to work on or what to prioritize because they're not getting communicated to. So, yeah, ultimately, yeah, communication is massive and probably one of the biggest themes of this podcast, just communicating properly and making sure that you communicate to your teammates, you communicate upward, and yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for joining on this episode of Lead Ahead. In conclusion, when transitioning from a team member to a team leader, you must ensure that you understand the qualities and the mindset that are required of good leaders. You must learn to delegate effectively and empower the employees on your team. You need to communicate frequently with your team and handle conflicts head on, making sure to be sensitive to individual personalities and to take feedback directly from them as a manager. So make sure to reach out to us via our social channels or on our D2L page to share your own experiences of leadership and to recommend topics for future episodes. Thanks, guys.